Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to dive back into some tasting history with Max Miller. Fantastic channel that for some reason I'm not subscribed to. I know I subscribed to him, and that's something I mentioned a few videos back, and you might want to check that, not only with this channel, but with any channel that you watch. Make sure you're still subscribed. I hear all the time from other YouTube content creators that people are finding themselves unsubscribed from a channel that they thought they were subscribed to. So you might want to double check that little bell, and you can turn on the notifications. That way, anytime there's a new video, it'll let you know that happened, and I would greatly appreciate that if you would consider that with me. So I'll put a link down in the description. If you've never seen Tasting History, it's a lens through which to view history by viewing the history of food and how it played a role, and how it was made and what it tasted like and how people used it. And since I love the American Civil War, some of you have suggested we check out this video on how to brew Civil War coffee with sweet potatoes. So this should be a fun one to check out. Let's dive in.
Other than shoes and bullets, nothing was more important to a Civil War soldier than coffee. Now, the North and South loved the stuff, but the Confederates definitely had a harder time getting their hands on it, so they came up with alternatives like this rye and sweet potato coffee, which was sent to General George Pickett from his wife.
So, yeah, you have to remember that right off the bat, the Union is going to use its significant naval supremacy to blockade the South. This is part of the economic part of defeating a industrially inferior, economically inferior South. Cut them off from trade with the outside world to get the things they need, but also to make money off of the export of cotton. And so in the South, mainly what they're going to do is they're going to make the most use of what they can make themselves. And so that's why, for example, you don't see all gray uniforms in the Southern Army. You see butternut very often because butternut could be made based on resources that they had. It's the kind of that brown color. That's why you don't see a lot of coffee, regular coffee, in the South, because they couldn't import it. But they had a lot of tobacco because they could produce that themselves in the South. And so a lot of times Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers would meet kind of in no man's land when there's no fighting going on and trade. And the Union soldiers would often trade coffee to a Confederate soldier in exchange for some tobacco, which was harder to get in the North.
So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we make Civil War coffee, or at least what passed as coffee, this time on Tasting History.
I hope you'll talk about chicory. We'll talk about it if he doesn't.
This week is the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and as a Civil War buff myself, I wanted to make a video that had some connection to that battle. Well, as it happens, one of the...
Random aside, why is it that we call people who are into the Civil War buffs, but we don't really use that term to describe other things? Like, I mean, sometimes we say history buff, I guess, and we say Civil War buff, but you don't hear World War II buff. It's usually enthusiasts. I don't know, just kind of a weird thing.
Most famous characters, persons, one of the most famous figures involved in that battle, General George Pickett, famous for his failed charge, which bears his name and marks the turning point in the war.
Which is really unfortunate because he led one of the 3 divisions in that attack.
He once received a care package from his wife, and it included the South's version of coffee. Come to think of it, my prentice, you must have been up all night to have made up and sent out such a basket of goodies, and baked and buttered such a lot of biscuits, and made so many jugs of coffee as came this morning. My, I tell you, it all tasted good, and the coffee, well, no mocha or java ever tasted half so good as this rye sweet potato blend. Bless your thoughtful heart. You know, as odious of a man as he was, and he was, he does write a pretty sweet letter. Anyway, I didn't actually think that I would find a recipe for this sweet potato and rye coffee, and technically I didn't, but it turns out the newspapers, especially early on in the war in the South, were filled with recipes for coffee alternatives, and I did find a recipe for sweet potato coffee and a recipe for rye coffee.
This actually makes a lot of sense because it's not just the military that can't get this stuff, it's the civilian populace as well. And so when you're used, I mean, imagine some of you watching this video, I know you get your your Starbucks every morning or your Dunkin', or you make your coffee at home. And I can remember growing up, it was the first thing in the morning that I smelled was my grandparents would have coffee. There would be a coffee pot going on the stove to get going in the morning. Imagine if suddenly something that's part of your everyday routine is no longer available to you for 4 years. So yeah, it makes sense people are publishing this in the newspaper. Here's some alternatives.
The sweet potato coffee recipe comes from the Albany Patriot in Georgia. Preparation. Peel your potatoes and slice them rather thin. Dry them in the air or on the stove, then cut into pieces small enough to go into the coffee mill, then grind it. 2 tablespoons of ground coffee and 3 or 4 of ground potatoes will make 8 or 9 cups of coffee. Clear, pure, and well-tasted. So what's interesting is this recipe calls for mixing the sweet potato coffee with real coffee. And that was possible at the very beginning of the war, which is when this recipe was written.
Right.
But as time progresses, most of the recipes drop off the coffee, and we'll talk about exactly why that was a little bit later. But for this sweet potato coffee, all you need is 4 or 5 sweet potatoes. But exactly what sweet potato they're talking about is not very clear, because then, just as now, the term sweet potato, especially in the South, was often used interchangeably with yam, and there are different types of sweet potato. So I think either one is going to work. I would steer clear from maybe purple sweet potatoes, but since you are looking for a coffee color, I wouldn't go with the white sweet potato, but something at least a little orange so it gives it some color. So wash and peel them, then slice them very thin and set them on some trays to dry. Now you can do this out in the sun, and I imagine it would kind of take all day. And I say I imagine because I tried it, but I had to abandon my endeavor because the squirrels just wouldn't leave them alone. So
we have a groundhog that lives under my deck, and my kids have taken it calling him Walter, as in Walter White, because they invented this whole story about how he's under the deck cooking meth, and then he comes out during the day and he lays there and doesn't move because he's high from tasting his own product.
Ended up putting them into the oven for about 3 hours on the very lowest setting until they became like sweet potato hardtack. Once they're nice and dry and have shriveled up really tiny, then
basically like making potato chips.
Break them up and then put them into a coffee grinder and grind until you have a powder. Wow. Now, according to the author of this recipe, the above is worthy of a trial. We have thoroughly tested its qualities and can perceive no difference in taste from the genuine coffee.
I love the way old newspapers wrote things like this. And, they didn't hold back on their opinions. Back then, the newspapers didn't pretend to be unbiased. They were mainly very much biased. That's why you have very often newspapers that were called the Daily Republican or the Center County Democrat, things like that. But they also were really blunt when it came to describing things. I wrote a book a couple years ago about the Whitaker family, which is one of my immigrant families. And my third great grandfather had a brother who was hit and killed by a train. And it very graphically described the condition of his body, about how his one shoulder and his head had been removed from his body by the train when it came across. And I have a fifth great grandmother who died in the 1850s, supposedly at the age of 115. She was probably more like 108. But they all claimed 115, and this made national news because she was so old. And it described how her grandson, who she lived with, went to the store, and when he came back, he found, quote, the old lady burned to a crisp because she had been smoking and it fell and caught her on fire or something. I don't know. Might have been spontaneous human combustion. But they didn't mess around back then.
We regard it as every way equal to Rio, Java, or the mocha coffee.
They talk about mocha back then?
But I guess we'll find out. But first, we need to make our rye component. And for that, the recipe comes from the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury. Take rye, boil it, but not so much as to burst the grain. Then dry it either in the sun or on the stove or in a kiln, after which it is ready for parching to be used like the real coffee bean. Prepared in this manner, it can hardly be distinguished from the genuine coffee.
How much of this is true and how much of this is just wishful thinking, that it's going to taste like the genuine thing?
Especially because this one does not call for any actual coffee included. It's just dried rye ground up. And so for this, what you need is a cup or so of rye added to a pot of boiling water, then reduce it to a simmer and let it simmer for about 12 minutes. Then strain them and let them dry. And just like the sweet potatoes, you can leave them out in the sun because squirrels don't like rye. Oh, it turns out, yes they do. They'll absolutely eat anything, or at least mess it around the yard, so leave it on a stove or put it in the oven. Once dried, they too are ready to grind. Now neither of these look anything like real coffee grounds, and they don't smell anything like real coffee grounds, but maybe they'll taste like real coffee grounds. But before we try that out, let me tell you a bit about coffee during the Civil War and why both North and South loved a cup, whether it was real or not.
Yeah. I mean, these guys would like grind it with the butts of their rifles and stuff. It was, I mean, they liked their coffee.
So like I said, the coffee situation during the Civil War really depended greatly on which side of the battlefield you were on, so I'm going to break this up into Union coffee and Confederate coffee. For those boys in blue, coffee was a big part of their ration. For every 100 men, they received 10 pounds of green coffee or 8 pounds of roasted and ground coffee. Green coffee being unroasted coffee, and it had a longer shelf life, so they did prefer to hand that out, but it meant that the men had to roast their own coffee, which they would often do either in a skillet or in a pot just over the fire. But a few people did have access to coffee roasters thanks to Wilder Dwight of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry.
Wilder Dwight, I did a video on him. If you go over and check out on Stories of the Civil War, we covered Wilder Dwight. He was one of the staff officers in the exact same regiment that Robert Gould Shaw was in. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, you've seen Matthew Broderick playing Shaw, and it opens with the Battle of Antietam. Wilder Dwight was one of his superior officers, and Dwight was killed mortally wounded at Antietam. And I covered that in my video on Robert Gould Shaw. Really fascinating guy, Wilder Dwight.
A few months after the war started, he wrote to his parents, "I wish you to buy and forward by express a large coffee roaster which will roast 30 or 40 pounds at a time. There is a kind, I am told. It would be of immense advantage to us." And only 2 weeks later, he wrote, "Coffee roaster has arrived and is merrily at work.
Nice.
This is a comfort. Tell father he is the regiment's friend, and I bless him."
I love it. And actually, if you watch the video that I did about this, he started writing a letter to his mother when the battle began, when they were waiting to advance. But he didn't finish it, and he stuck it in his pocket. And when he was mortally wounded, he got the letter back out and wrote a few more lines on it, and you can see the huge difference in his handwriting in the letter. And it's blood-stained and everything. He wrote to his parents quite often.
Once roasted, then they had to grind their own coffee beans, either with a pan or hitting them with a bayonet, though some have said that they would hit them with the butt of their rifle, which seems like a terrible way to treat a rather important tool on the...
They didn't hit it. They would, just imagine putting some coffee beans on a barrel or something, and then they would use it to kind of grind it. They wouldn't be like banging it like that.
Battlefield. But there was actually a gun called the Sharp's carbine, which in some models was fitted with a hand-cranked grinder in the stock and was often referred to as a coffee grinder. Now, it probably wasn't actually meant for coffee. Nobody seems to know what it was really meant for, but after practical tests in recent years, they've determined it's likely that it was used to grind charcoal for gunpowder, which would make sense to have that in the butt of your carbine, your gun. But maybe some people did use it as a coffee grinder.
Why
It was
not?
called a coffee grinder often, but probably just because it looked like a coffee grinder.
Necessity is the mother of invention. You need a way to grind coffee, you've got that available to you. You're going to make a way of doing that.
But maybe people were mashing them with the butt of their gun and thought, hey, we should just put a grinder in the coffee or in the gun. I don't know. But whatever they did, once they had their grounds, it was time to make your coffee. Now, a lot of 19th century recipes for coffee have you boil the water with the coffee grounds in it. But the coffee should not be put in the water before it boils. At first I was green enough to do so, but soon learned better, being compelled to march before the water boiled, and consequently lost my coffee. I lost both the water and the coffee.
Osborne Oldroyd! Oh man, he is hitting all the right notes today, man. I'm writing a book on the 20th Ohio right now, and Osborne Oldroyd was in Company E of the 20th Ohio. I kept a diary during the Vicksburg campaign, and I've read from that diary and videos from Vicksburg. Really, really cool stuff. He was a sergeant and actually ended up commanding his company at the Battle of Raymond in May of 1863 because all of the officers above him were killed or wounded.
All that work to roast and grind it, and he lost his coffee. And there was nothing worse than losing your coffee. Coffee was their staff of life, and they must have it, no matter what risk attended. The most disheartening event that could happen a soldier was to be called into line just as his coffee pot was beginning to bubble.
So another video I did, and I'm not intentionally trying to toot my own horn with videos here, but it's just making me think of these stories. The Battle of Antietam, again, the commissary sergeant for the 23rd Ohio Infantry was William McKinley, and they nicknamed him Coffee Bill. They didn't call him Food Bill or Pancake Bill. Coffee was what they really cared about. And so one of the things people remembered from the Battle of Antietam was that while they were under fire, Coffee Bill was still making sure that they got their hot coffee during some downtime. Even though they were under fire, they weren't directly in combat at that time. And so getting their coffee was a huge comfort to them. And he actually got a battlefield commission right after the Battle of Antietam.
That was Fenwick Headley of the 32nd Illinois Infantry, and he says that the men needed their coffee no matter what risk attended, i.e., people would risk their lives to get coffee. And perhaps the most famous person to do this was a 19-year-old commissary sergeant named William McKinley, future president of the United States. On September 17th, 1862,
Take a drink, everybody. I have Dr. Pepper, so that's what I'm drinking for the VTH drinking game today.
Ohio Regiment was at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Early in the afternoon, naturally enough, with the exertion required of the men, they were famished and thirsty, and to some extent broken in spirit. The commissary department of that brigade was under Sergeant McKinley's administration and personal supervision. From his hands, every man in the regiment was served with hot coffee and warm meats. He passed under fire and delivered with his own hands these things so essential for the men for whom he was laboring. What I find fascinating is that quote was from an officer in that same regiment named Rutherford B. Hayes, another future president of the United States.
The only regiment in the Civil War. There were 2,000 or so regiments in the Union Army. One regiment had 2 future presidents in it.
2 future presidents in one regiment. Kind of crazy.
Now, I will say Rutherford B. Hayes did not participate in the Battle of Antietam because he was the commanding officer of the 23rd Ohio, and he had actually been wounded during the campaign leading up to the Battle of Antietam. But I'm going to put links to these videos down in the description that I've been talking about. The one about Coffee Bill. It's probably the biggest monument on the Antietam battlefield, or one of the biggest monuments, is the one to President McKinley, which is right above Burnside Bridge. And some of those other ones, the one about Wilder Dwight and Robert Gould Shaw, I'll put links down in the description to those.
Later in McKinley's political career, he used the event as kind of part of his origin story, and at the battlefield today, there is a monument that commemorates history's most dangerous coffee run.
Yeah, they actually tried to use it as an insult in calling him Coffee Bill, kind of mocking his opponents would use it to mock his Civil War service, but he ended up a brevet major by the end of the war. And he was certainly brave and certainly fought in combat after this. But it didn't work. It backfired.
Now, the reason that someone would risk their life to get coffee to the troops was because the caffeine in that coffee was essential to many. They would often call it their nerve tonic. And there were some soldiers or even generals who really, really believed in the virtues of this nerve tonic, of the caffeine.
Even if nothing else, if it was a mental, like if it helped with morale and it helped men to believe in themselves more, it was worth it for that alone.
Was General Benjamin Butler. He would have his men pour the water out of their canteens and fill them instead with coffee. And it's said that he would even plan attacks around the time of day when his troops were most caffeinated. he told one general that if your men get their coffee early in the morning, you can
Whoa,
hold.
that's awesome.
That said, Butler is often considered one of the worst generals the Union had, so maybe his advice should be taken with a grain of salt. But it wasn't just him who loved an excess of coffee, as what we each man drank at every meal would keep a New England family a day. And Alexander Downing of the 11th Iowa Infantry wrote, "One man in our company, Long John as the boys have nicknamed him, is a great coffee drinker. He carries a 2-quart peach can strapped to his haversack, and every day buys up 1 or 2 rations of coffee from the boys who do not use much."
This is like some of you, or maybe you have a friend, or maybe it's you yourself, who it does not matter what else is happening. You're taking time to run through the drive-thru at Dunkin' or Starbucks or whatever it is. You have to have that every day.
Though poor coffee-loving Long John would have been frustrated as the war went on, because even the Union began to have trouble getting good coffee. In 1863, an Ohio soldier wrote, "There is a good deal of complaint in our company, at least, about the coffee we get. It seems not quite so good as that we have had, and I suspect it has been adulterated by someone who is willing to get rich at the expense of the poor soldier."
That's Osborne Oldroyd again.
And by the end of the war, Ebenezer Gilpin lamented, "We are reduced to about quarter rations and no coffee." And nobody can soldier without coffee.
That's awesome.
But he wrote that in April of 1863.
Yeah, that was after the war.
After General Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. While General Lee's men, the rebel soldiers, well, they'd been going without coffee since pretty much day one. The Anaconda Plan was General Winfield Scott's idea to completely blockade the South from getting any supplies from outside the Confederacy, and this meant no coffee was coming in from Brazil or the other coffee-growing regions. And just a few months after Fort Sumter was fired upon, Southern newspapers start including recipes for fake coffee.
Yep.
Like I said, at first, they were just a way to supplement your coffee, to make what coffee you had last a little bit longer. But very, very quickly, like within the first year, coffee is pretty much gone, and it's just recipes for something warm to drink that might look and taste like coffee.
So we talk, again, all the time about lenses through which to view history, and you can see why this is a fascinating way of looking at the Civil War, because it gives us a sliver of a glimpse into a much larger issue, which was the ability to feed and supply and equip your army in the field. And like for the Union Army, it's not just about the imports, because the Union's for the most part able to import what they need, but it's about as you're advancing deeper and deeper into enemy territory, the supply lines are getting longer, and that means there's more steps that supplies have to go through in order to get to you. That's more hands. That means more opportunities for greed and avarice and corruption, and people getting their hands on their stuff. They talk about this in Band of Brothers. They talk about how because they were, and I don't know if it's in the TV show, but I think it was in the book, because they were all the way down in Austria, for example. They were so far down the line of the advance of the Allies that everything anybody wanted had already been taken by the other steps that had gone through, the troops that had gotten their hands on it before it got to them. So by the time things got to them, it was the crappiest cigarettes, and it was the crappiest chocolate, and it was the crappiest food. And the same way here.
These coffee alternatives became known as Lincoln coffee and were made of, among other things, acorns, rice, okra, peanuts, asparagus, persimmons, field peas, beets, rye, sweet potato, and even cotton seeds. In New Orleans, they would use chicory, which proved so popular that years later, when coffee became available again, they continued to use the chicory as well. You can still get it with your beignets at Café du Monde, which set up shop in 1862 during the Civil War. Though I do believe it is now blended with caffeinated coffee. Though caffeinated or non-caffeinated just chicory coffee still sounds preferable to what Luther Hopkins of the 6th Virginia Infantry described. During the winter months, when we needed some kind of beverage to wash down our hardtack, the only thing we could get was horse feed, which was roasted and boiled. We called it coffee. We had to rob our horses for this, and we all felt mean when we didn't. And if a Confederate soldier was able to get their hands on real coffee, it was usually done by trading with Union soldiers. Our boys and the Johnnies on the skirmish line entered into an agreement not to fire on one another. Boys would meet between the lines, exchange tobacco for coffee. The Rebs were always very anxious to get hold of New York papers. But if you weren't able to get it in a swap, then you'd better be saving your pennies if you wanted to have some real coffee. Because at the beginning of the war, in March of 1861, 1 pound of coffee was sold for $1.20 in the Confederacy. But by the end of the war, it was up to $196 a pound.
And that's not, though, just about the scarcity of it. That also is an indication of just how devalued Confederate currency was by that point.
And now the Confederate dollar was way devalued, but even so, that was really, really expensive for some coffee. That is why most were dependent on these faux coffees. But if the recipes were to be believed, you couldn't tell the difference between the fake coffee and a real cup of coffee.
I bet you can.
Like one recipe for war coffee. It called for mixing equal parts coffee and equal parts cornmeal, and swore that I have used it for 2 weeks, and several friends visiting my house say they could not discover anything peculiar in the taste of my coffee, but pronounced it very good. Try it and see if we can't get along comfortably even while our ports are blockaded by the would-be king. And there were tons of these recipes, and they all read very similarly, always ending with, "And you'll never believe it's not coffee." Kind of reminds me of those "I can't believe it's not butter" ads from the 90s.
I can't believe it's not butter.
But just like Family Guy mocked those ads,
I can't believe.
So too did the newspapers of the South mock the recipes for the faux coffee. Like this one from the Arkansas True Democrat. Recipes for the times. To make coffee, take tan bark, 3 parts, 3 old cigar stumps, and a quart of water. Mix well and boil 15 minutes in a dirty coffee pot. And the best judges cannot tell it from the finest mocha. And they mocked it because as much as people tried to convince themselves that this stuff tasted like real coffee, it didn't, and they knew it. After every experiment to make coffee of what was not coffee, we were driven to decide that there was nothing coffee but coffee. And when a British officer, Sir Arthur Lyon Fremantle, visited the Confederate
state... So if
state...
you've seen the movie Gettysburg, this is the British officer that they portray in that. That's Arthur Fremantle.
It's in 1863, he remarked, "The loss of coffee afflicts the Confederates even more than the loss of spirits, and they exercise their ingenuity in devising substitutes which are not generally very successful." Nobody was fooled. Which is why I'm really curious what this rye and sweet potato coffee is going to taste like. So to start off, bring a quart of water to a boil. You can use a coffee pot or just a regular pot, or if you have a mucket, use that. Muckets were what many of the soldiers would have boiled their coffee in, and basically it's just a tin canister. Once it's boiling, add a heaping quarter cup of the coffee mixture. I am using half the sweet potato and half the rye, but you could use like a third sweet potato, a third rye, and a third regular coffee if it's the beginning of the war and you still had access to coffee. What you don't want to do is add it while it's boiling. You want to turn off the heat and then add it, because if you add it while it's boiling, it does this. So take it off the heat, add the grounds, and let it steep for 7 or 8 minutes or until all of the grounds have fallen to the bottom of the pot. Then you can pour yourself a cup of General Pickett's rye and sweet potato coffee. So I have the tin cup here, but I also poured it into a glass so you can see a little better what this actually looks like.
Or cider.
And it ain't coffee. Now, one of the early recipes would have you add coffee as well, so it probably would look a lot more like coffee, but this looks more like tea or apple cider. The thing is...
That's exactly the two things I said it looked like. I love that he and I are on the same wavelength today.
It smells really good. It smells like sweet potatoes. Let's give it a go.
By the way, if you are a person who likes a little bit of alcohol, but not too crazy, like I do, I don't like to drink to excess ever, I discovered I like to experiment. I like to play around with like ideas and things like that. And so I mixed 2 cups of apple cider with 3 shots of Fireball whiskey. Oh yeah, so good. It's a good fall drink. Really good. I'm going to have one later.
It's very, very hot. That's very, very hot. But, tastes like sweet potatoes. It is sweet potato tea. I'm not sure
Sweet
that the
potato
rye necessarily...
tea.
No, it does. It adds kind of a nuttiness to it. But coffee? No.
No, but listen, I mean, if you don't have coffee, don't just lie to yourself and say it's coffee. Just say, you know what? At least we got a drink. It's not water. It's something.
But good, yes. Also, I have some hardtack here.
Oh, nice.
A little
Dip it
broken piece of hardtack that I just want to dip in it because that's often how they would have eaten their hardtack, was just dipping it into coffee
Soften it up.
to soften it up.
Yep.
Doesn't really work in this cup, but I'll have a tiny
wide.
piece that hopefully I won't break my teeth on. I don't know how long it needs to soak. Probably longer than that. Yeah, longer than that. Well, I got a little bit off. This is 2 years old at this point. And still as tasteless as the day it was baked.
So I guess he didn't taste the one with the rye. We just got him tasting the sweet potato one. But interesting. That was fun. I enjoyed that. I love the way he uses that lens to look at history. We get a great history lesson, but also get to see what things might have been like. At some point, I would love an opportunity to like experience some of these things for myself, tasting it. And maybe I'll talk to the guys from the Townsends or talk to these guys and just get connected with them and experience some of this for myself. Let me know in the comment section below if there's another one of his videos you'd like me to take a look at, and check out those links down in the description, but also I'll put a couple up on the screen to the videos that I did telling a little more of some of these stories we talked about. Thanks for watching.